John pulled into the driveway late at night, rain pouring down as his headlights cut through the darkness. He stepped out quickly, heart racing, only to find his best friend, Rusty, the loyal old dog, curled up against the wall, soaked and trembling in the storm. In the doorway stood Linda, arms crossed, her voice calm but cold as she said, "That dog doesn't belong here anymore." Rusty let out a soft cry that pierced John's heart. He rushed forward, eyes wide, his voice breaking. "Why would you do this?" Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In that moment, everything shifted, as John realized the life he knew was about to change forever. John's earliest memories with Rusty weren't just moments of companionship. They were proof of loyalty, day after day, in ways words could never capture. Rusty was there at the gate every evening when John came home from long shifts, tail wagging no matter how late or how tired John was. Neighbors often spoke about how remarkable it was that the dog seemed to know the sound of John's car before it even turned the corner. Through job struggles, through late nights finishing paperwork, through moments when life felt heavy, Rusty's presence was steady, gentle, and reassuring. That bond wasn't just between a man and his pet. It was the comfort of trust that never broke. It was this devotion that made what John discovered on that stormy night so painful to comprehend, because the last thing he ever expected was to see that same faithful companion abandoned in the rain. Linda entered John's life with a certain grace and elegance that made her stand out in every room. Friends described her as stylish, careful with her words, and confident in her presence. But in private, John began to notice a different side, one that rarely found patience with Rusty. She would wrinkle her nose when the dog lay near the living room, quietly complain about hairs on the couch, and insist that animals belonged outside, not in a house like theirs. At first, John brushed it aside, telling himself it was simply a difference in upbringing, that maybe Linda wasn't used to animals. But over time, the remarks sharpened. She would casually remark at dinner that the dog was too much work, or question why John spent so much money at the vet. Little by little, John sensed a gap forming between the woman he thought he knew and the life he was trying to build with both her and Rusty. The neighbors weren't blind to these tensions. One evening, an older neighbor named Mr. Carter stopped John at the mailbox and, in a quiet tone, said words that would echo later in his mind. "Son, people show you who they are by the way they treat those who depend on them." At the time, John shrugged it off, thinking the man was simply being cautious. Linda's charm in public covered any signs of coldness, and to most people, she seemed warm, generous, and polite. But behind closed doors, subtle moments told a different story. On days when John was away at work, he'd come home to find Rusty's bed moved to the far corner of the house. Once, he overheard her instructing the household help to keep that dog outside, as if Rusty were nothing more than a nuisance. John would argue softly, defending Rusty, reminding her that the dog had been part of his life long before she came along, but Linda always brushed it aside as if it were trivial. John's love for Rusty only deepened in the face of these small conflicts. He remembered nights during his hardest years when Rusty's steady breathing at his side was the only thing that kept him from feeling completely alone. When storms rattled the windows, Rusty stayed close, resting his head at John's feet. That kind of loyalty wasn't replaceable, and John couldn't imagine his life without it. But with every passing month, Linda's tolerance seemed to shrink. If Rusty padded into the kitchen during dinner, she would sigh heavily, pushing her plate back as if the mere presence of the dog ruined the meal. If Rusty barked at the doorbell, she would roll her eyes and mutter under her breath about how tiresome it all was. These weren't acts of open cruelty, but they built a steady unease that John couldn't ignore. What stung most was Linda's lack of understanding for what Rusty meant to him. On their wedding day, Rusty had been right there in the backyard, wagging his tail as John said his vows. The dog had seen John through heartbreaks, through the loss of his parents, through the days when it seemed there was no one else in the world who cared. Rusty wasn't just a pet, he was family. And yet, When John would share old stories about how Rusty had comforted him in the darkest times, Linda would dismiss them with a light laugh, as though such devotion was trivial. She saw the dog as a distraction from the life she wanted. Polished, refined, and uninterrupted. John, however, saw in Rusty a reminder of resilience, a connection to everything that had kept him standing through life's storms. By the time the night of the rain came, these small moments had stacked up in John's memory like warning signs he hadn't wanted to read. He recalled each remark, each sigh, each complaint, and wondered if he had been blind to the truth the whole time. Friends had cautioned him, neighbors had dropped quiet hints, and yet he had chosen to believe that with time, things would balance out. He thought love was enough to bridge the gap between Linda and Rusty. But as he stood in the storm that night, staring at his loyal companion trembling outside while Linda's words echoed in the doorway, John realized that every subtle hint had been pointing to this moment all along. At first, John tried to believe that Linda's cold remarks toward Rusty were nothing more than passing frustrations, the kind of minor disagreements that married couples could learn to overlook. But slowly, the small comments gave way to sharper actions. One evening, John came home to find Rusty left outside on the back porch while rain fell steadily, the dog's coat soaked through and his eyes searching for comfort. John rushed to let him in, wrapping him in a towel and whispering reassurances. When he turned to Linda for an explanation, she only shrugged, saying, Rusty needed to learn his place. John felt an ache in his chest, because this was no longer just about preferences or differences in opinion. It was becoming a wedge driven deeper into his home. He loved his wife, but he couldn't understand how she could look at Rusty's trembling frame and not feel what he felt. The more John defended Rusty, the more Linda began to push back, as if every show of affection toward the dog was a challenge to her place in the home. At dinner one night, when Rusty laid his head near John's feet, Linda leaned back with a half smile and said in front of visiting relatives, "If you care so much for that dog, maybe you should take your meals with him instead." Laughter flickered around the table, but John's stomach tightened. He forced a smile, unwilling to cause a scene. Yet inside he felt both embarrassment and pain. Later, when the guests had gone, Linda's words echoed in his mind. To her, it had been a joke, perhaps even a display of wit. But to John, it was an open mockery of the bond that had carried him through the hardest years of his life. It was the first time he realized that what he felt for Rusty was becoming a public target for ridicule. The gossip didn't stop within their walls. Linda began to repeat variations of the same theme among friends and neighbors, painting John as a man who valued a dog above his own household. It was subtle at first, woven into casual conversations. "John's always fussing over that dog," she would say, laughing lightly as if it were harmless. But the tone shifted over time. "Sometimes I wonder if he loves that animal more than he loves me." Those words carried farther than she realized, and whispers made their way back to John. People he had known for years now looked at him with curious expressions, uncertain whether to laugh or sympathize. What stung most was that Linda's words stripped away the dignity of something pure and good, his loyalty to Rusty, and twisted it into something others could mock. John felt trapped between defending what he knew was right and keeping peace in a marriage that was beginning to feel increasingly fragile. Rusty, faithful as always, seemed to sense the rising tension. He lingered more at John's side, resting his head on his lap in the evenings, following him from room to room with quiet devotion. But the dog's energy was fading. The night spent outside, the dampness, the cold, all of it began to take its toll. John noticed Rusty's once lively steps becoming slower, his breathing heavier after only short moments of play. John would kneel beside him, running his hand through his damp fur, promising that things would get better. Yet the contrast was impossible to ignore. Every time Rusty tried to find a place near the hearth, Linda would gesture for him to be moved, insisting he didn't belong there. Each act chipped away at John's peace of mind, leaving him to wonder how much longer Rusty could endure such treatment. And in his heart, he carried a question he wasn't ready to voice aloud. How much longer could he? The conflict reached its sharpest edge one stormy evening when John returned home later than usual. The rain poured in heavy sheets, and as he parked the car, he thought immediately of Rusty, hoping Linda had allowed him to stay inside. But when John opened the door, his heart sank. Rusty was lying outside again, fur plastered against his body, a faint shiver running through him. John rushed forward, scooping him up and carrying him inside. His clothes were soaked, his arms ached, but none of it mattered. Linda stood by the window, her expression unreadable. When John demanded to know why, she tilted her head slightly and said words that would stay with him forever. "If you care so much for that dog, then maybe you should live out there with him." Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the sting was sharp. For John, it was not just a comment. It was a dividing line, drawn clearly across the life they shared. As days turned into weeks, the pattern repeated. John found himself caught between two loyalties: the vows he had made to his wife and the devotion he owed to the friend who had never let him down. Each time Linda closed the door on Rusty, John opened it. Each time she spoke lightly of the dog as a nuisance, John bent down to offer comfort. The weight of those choices grew heavier, because in protecting Rusty, John felt the growing distance in his marriage. Friends noticed his quietness, neighbors saw his distracted expression, and John knew he could no longer deny the truth. The bond between himself and Rusty was being tested not just by circumstance, but by deliberate choice. And though he tried to keep peace, though he tried to believe things could change, the sight of Rusty growing weaker each day made one truth unavoidable. Something had to give, and soon. That night, the storm came in heavy, with winds shaking the shutters and rain striking the pavement like a drumbeat. John had finished work earlier than expected, a rare occurrence that sent him driving home before the hour Linda expected him. As he turned onto his street, the headlights cut across his driveway and his heart quickened with unease. Something about the house felt still, too quiet, too tense. He parked and stepped out, pulling his jacket close against the downpour, but what he saw made the breath catch in his chest. Through the rain and the faint glow of the porch light, Linda stood at the doorway with her hand on Rusty's collar, pushing him outside with a look of irritation that chilled John more than the storm itself. The old dog stumbled, his legs weak beneath him, until his body slid against the wall, collapsing in exhaustion. For a long moment, John couldn't move. The sight of Rusty lying there, rain soaking into his thinning coat, left him frozen in place. He had seen glimpses of Linda's impatience before, heard her dismissive words, but he had never witnessed it escalate into something so undeniable. Rusty, the same dog who had met him with joy every day of his life, now lay struggling to stay upright, eyes heavy, his body too weak to resist. John rushed forward, kneeling in the rain, cradling Rusty's head gently as water streamed down his face. "It's okay, boy, I'm here," he whispered, though his voice trembled. When he looked up, Linda's arms were folded across her chest, her expression calm, almost satisfied. She didn't flinch under his stare. Instead, a faint smirk crossed her lips as though she believed she still held control of the moment, as though his love for Rusty was nothing more than a burden she could dismiss with ease. But Linda hadn't noticed the shifting presence beyond the yard. The storm had drawn neighbors to their windows, concerned by the raised voices and the thud of movement against the porch. Slowly, cautiously, a few of them stepped out, umbrellas raised against the rain. One by one, they began to gather along the edge of the driveway, their faces dimly lit by the glow of streetlights. They said nothing at first, but their silence carried weight. John could feel their eyes on him, could sense that what had once been whispered behind his back was now being witnessed with clarity. Linda, unaware of the small crowd forming, continued to stand as if untouchable, her head tilted slightly, the faintest trace of condescension still in her stance. It was only when John lifted Rusty into his arms, holding him close despite the rain drenching them both, that the hush of the neighborhood began to stir into quiet murmurs. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. John could feel Rusty's shallow breathing against his chest, each rise and fall reminding him of how fragile the dog had become. He turned his gaze back toward Linda, his eyes filled not only with disbelief but with something steadier, stronger. He realized then that whatever illusion had held this household together was shattering in front of witnesses. No longer could Linda's charm shield her actions. No longer could whispers be ignored. The neighbors, standing firm against the rain, had seen enough to draw their own conclusions. Some exchanged glances, others shook their heads, and though no words were spoken aloud, their disapproval filled the space louder than thunder. Linda remained still, unaware of how quickly the ground beneath her reputation was slipping, unaware that the image she so carefully protected was beginning to unravel. As John carried Rusty inside, the neighbors didn't move. They stayed, silent sentinels in the storm, watching every step. Their presence was not confrontational, but it was undeniable, a quiet testimony that the truth was now visible to all. Inside, John placed Rusty gently onto a blanket near the hearth, drying him as best he could, whispering comfort into ears that had always listened without judgment. Through the window, the dim silhouettes of neighbors still stood in the rain, unwilling to disperse. For John, it was a turning point he could never forget, not just because of the pain of seeing Rusty so weakened, but because in that moment he knew the balance of power had shifted. He was no longer the only one who knew what was happening inside his home. The silence of the night had broken, and Linda's actions could no longer remain hidden. The morning after that storm, John awoke with a clarity he had not felt in years. The sight of Rusty lying weak against the wall, the sound of neighbors murmuring in disapproval, and the memory of Linda's faint smirk had stripped away every excuse he had made to himself. For too long, he had believed that patience would heal the rift, that love would smooth out the differences. But as he looked at Rusty resting on the blanket, fragile yet still wagging his tail with faint loyalty, John knew that the line had been crossed. He had once thought marriage vows demanded sacrifice, but nothing could justify watching a faithful companion suffer at the hands of someone who should have shared his heart. By sunrise, John had made his choice. If Linda could cast out Rusty, then he would no longer allow her to remain in a home that loyalty had built. The confrontation was quiet, but final. John stood in the living room, suitcase in hand, as Linda entered, her expression expectant as though nothing had changed. But John's voice, steady and unwavering, cut through the silence. "You pushed Rusty out into the storm. From this day forward, you will not do the same to me." Linda laughed at first, dismissing his words as a burst of emotion, but when John stepped aside and gestured to the door, her composure faltered. "Leave," he said, his tone calm, resolute. "The same way you forced him out, you will leave this house." Shock flickered across her face, but John did not waver. The door closed behind her with the same finality with which she had once closed it on Rusty. The act was not cruel, nor was it vengeful. It was justice, measured and undeniable, witnessed by neighbors who had seen enough to understand why. Whispers spread quickly through the community. Neighbors who had once smiled politely at Linda now turned away when she passed. Friends she had charmed at dinners and gatherings found reasons to decline her invitations. Word of that stormy night traveled farther than she expected, and though John never spoke ill of her, the silence of others carried more weight than any accusations could. Relatives who had admired her elegance now called with disappointment, asking how she could disregard the most basic act of compassion. It was not John who destroyed her reputation. It was her own choices revealed in plain sight. For every time she had mocked his loyalty to Rusty, there now stood an audience who understood the depth of that loyalty and the emptiness of her disdain. Slowly, her carefully built image began to crumble, not by scandal but by the quiet power of truth finally brought to light. John's next steps were deliberate, guided not by anger but by principle. He sought legal counsel, filing for divorce and ensuring that the assets she had once flaunted would no longer be a source of her comfort. Court documents were served, and Linda found herself confronted with the reality that choices had consequences beyond the walls of their home. Accounts were frozen, properties contested, and the foundation of wealth she had leaned on began to slip from her grasp. For John, it was not about financial gain but about drawing a line, ensuring that someone who had cast aside loyalty would not continue to profit from a life built on it. Each legal step was another reminder that her actions had weight, and with every filing, Linda was forced to reckon with the truth she had once believed she could conceal. Yet the greatest justice did not come from courts or neighbors' whispers. It came from John's quiet determination to turn pain into purpose. With Rusty recovering slowly under veterinary care, John decided that no other animal should endure what his companion had suffered. Using resources he had once saved for joint ventures with Linda, he began building a modest shelter, a place where abandoned or neglected animals could find safety and care. The community, moved by his story and inspired by his resilience, rallied around the project. Volunteers offered their time, donors gave what they could, and soon a once-empty lot became a sanctuary carrying Rusty's name. When the doors opened, families who had heard whispers of Linda's cruelty now celebrated John's compassion, and the narrative shifted entirely. What had begun as heartbreak transformed into a legacy of kindness that extended far beyond his own home. For Linda, the reversal was stark. Once admired for her elegance, she now found doors closing in places where they had always been open. Invitations ceased, admiration turned to avoidance, and every attempt to restore her image was overshadowed by the quiet truth of what she had done. She had dismissed loyalty as weakness, yet it was that very loyalty, between John and Rusty, and now between John and his community, that defined her downfall. As John stood at the ribbon cutting of the new shelter, Rusty resting gently at his side, the applause of neighbors carried across the field. In that moment, John did not celebrate Linda's absence, nor did he seek her humiliation. Instead, he honored the devotion that had never failed him, proving that compassion outlasts arrogance and that justice, when it arrives, speaks louder than mockery ever could. Rusty's recovery was not immediate, but every step forward felt like a victory to John. After the storm, John brought him to a local veterinarian who examined the dog carefully, prescribing rest, warmth, and steady care. John spent long evenings by Rusty's side, feeding him small portions, drying his fur after gentle baths, and speaking softly as if his words alone could restore strength. Days passed into weeks, and though Rusty's movements were slow, his eyes still carried the spark of devotion that had always defined him. The first time his tail gave a faint wag again, John felt his chest tighten with relief. It was a simple gesture, but in it was the message that Rusty was not giving up. That bond, tested in the storm, had endured, and every effort John made reminded him of why loyalty was worth every sacrifice. As Rusty regained strength, the house began to feel alive again. Without Linda's disapproving gaze, there was no longer a need to hide the dog's presence. No more arguments about where he should sleep or how close he should be allowed to sit. Rusty returned to his familiar place by the fireplace, his head resting near John's chair, content in the warmth of a home where he was finally safe. For John, these quiet evenings were a reminder of what mattered most. He no longer carried the burden of explaining or defending the love he held for his companion. Instead, he embraced it freely, knowing that true loyalty deserved acknowledgement, not criticism. As word of the new shelter spread and support continued to grow, John realized that what had once been a personal heartbreak had now become a cause that touched an entire community. On the day the shelter officially opened, John stood before neighbors, friends, and supporters who had gathered to celebrate the achievement. Rusty, still a little slower than before but undeniably stronger, sat proudly at his side. John's voice trembled slightly as he addressed those who had come, not with rehearsed speeches, but with the honesty of a man who had endured pain and chosen compassion. He told them of Rusty's devotion, of the nights when a faithful companion had been his only comfort, and of the choice to turn betrayal into hope. Applause rose not only for the shelter itself, but for the resilience it represented. Where Linda had once sought to diminish the value of loyalty, John had transformed it into a lasting legacy, one that would outlive the storm and outshine the cruelty that had tried to silence it. Later that evening, back in the quiet of his home, John knelt beside Rusty, stroking the familiar fur and whispering words that carried the weight of years. "You were loyal when no one else was." Rusty's tail moved gently, his eyes filled with the same trust they had always held. In that small moment, John felt the circle of their story complete. Everything that had been broken was slowly mending, not through grand victories or public praise, but through the steady return of trust and companionship. The storm had passed, and though the scars remained, so too did the unshakable truth that love given freely endures far longer than selfishness ever can. As sunlight returned in the days that followed, washing the world clean after weeks of rain, John often stood at his window, watching Rusty explore the yard with cautious steps, his tail lifting higher with each passing day. The pain of betrayal had not disappeared, but it no longer defined him. Instead, John carried with him the lesson that cruelty can strip away dignity in a single moment, but loyalty leaves a legacy that arrogance can never destroy. In the warmth of the morning light, with Rusty by his side, John knew the storm had given him more than it had taken. It had given him clarity, strength, and the certainty that in the end, compassion would always have the final word.